All right, everybody, welcome back to Think for Christ. Today, I'm once again joined by Andrew Payne, and together we're going to be embarking on a new series of episodes that we're calling We Who Wrestle with Jordan Peterson. In this series, we're going to be critically reviewing and interacting with Jordan Peterson's 2024 book titled We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine. Now, most people today have at least heard of Jordan Peterson, even if they've not interacted with his books or online content. Peterson is, without question, one of the leading public intellectuals of our day, and he commands massive influence over our Western culture, especially, I would contend, among young men. So, Andrew, let's kick this thing off by talking briefly about Peterson himself and the influence that he's had on Western culture in general, and specifically on Western Christianity. So what are your thoughts about the man and his influence?
Right out the gate, I want to say that I'm a fan, and so when I say anything critical, I want it to be couched in that. But Jordan Peterson, I've mentioned this book probably every single episode that we've done so far. But Jordan Peterson, I think, is probably the guy more than anyone who's responsible for kicking off the surprising rebirth of the belief in God, as Justin Brierley refers to it. And the thing is, like, if we set the stage for what the intellectual world looked like when he showed up, if you talked about myth with any degree of seriousness, you would be basically laughed out of the academy. If you talked about religious, even some of I say this with respect, I mean, like even some of the wonkier aspects of religion, which would usually be relegated to the mythical side, right? Then again, you would even quite likely be criticized within seminaries and so forth, right? Like it's a very different landscape, because the new atheists are the ones that everybody's contending with at this time. That it's not just that we're living in a materialist world, we're living in a hyper-materialistic world wherein even asking in philosophy the question of being, for example, which is the fundamental question of philosophy throughout its entire history, it's kind of verboten at this time. That essentially, when Peterson shows up, this is a world wherein we have been completely demythologized, we have been completely disenchanted, and he starts standing up for things like the re-enchantment of the world. And his impact there, I think, as much as anything, it didn't bring about the end of the new atheists, but precisely it occurred at precisely the moment that they were kind of dropping off, that movement in culture was dropping off. And so he, I think, created a bit of the catalyst whereby new movements, such as this surprising rebirth of the belief in God, can be launched into the forefront of society. Now, that also occurs, I think, alongside something else that's occurring in the more political domain of the Western society at that time. And of course, everybody knows that in 2016, it was Peterson's encounter with, I think it was Bill C-16, I want to say, that was in Canada, that was going to be a profound restriction on free speech, that he stood up against it. And it was, I think, a video of him on a college campus goes viral, wherein he's talking down a whole bunch of activist students, and his responses to them sort of made him a superstar overnight. And there was a documentary, I think it's still on Amazon, actually, that was some of his students were filming him at the time, and they had already started the documentary when he suddenly just blew up and became famous. And there's a couple of places in that documentary where he's talking with his wife, and he just says, "Yeah, man, this is weird." Now, let me also digress to say this. I am not going to do a Jordan Peterson impression at all during this episode, because nobody wants to hear that. So he says,
I want to hear that.
No, no. So he shows up on the scene right around the same time. People are basically, as Justin Brierley puts it in The Surprising Rebirth of the Belief in God, people are starting to discover that the claims of the new atheists, which were claims essentially saying that we can offer you a more rational grasp of the world, one that will resolve all the conflicts and bring about a freer world, right? That idea has just crumbled and been proven hollow, that nobody actually turned out to be particularly perceptive in this new atheist group. And in fact, they just caused a whole bunch of more cantankerous discourse online. And
it was, and I think it was because the new atheism was, at the end of the day, essentially a destructive movement
Yeah.
You know, it was a wrecking ball to religious belief, especially Christianity. But then, after they had done that work, they turned to then try to transform this destructive movement into a constructive movement. They tried to then use the principles of atheism as a foundation for human fulfillment and wholeness and well-being, and that project utterly failed.
Yeah, yeah, and it's quite hilarious. Brierley doesn't go into it at this point in his book, but Dawkins does get canceled at one point. Richard Dawkins is about, the guy basically that represents it more than anyone else. You've got the four horsemen of the new atheist, one of whom, by the way, hilariously is quoted in this opening chapter or opening preface in support of Peterson's reading of a biblical text. So Daniel Dennett's that one. But you have Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. That are the four horsemen of the new atheism. And one of their
two of whom are now deceased.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so one of the most hilarious things is that Dawkins ran this argument that, well, they all did, that we are the science, that kind of Fauci line, right? Like, we're the science type deal, that we represent the science and you're just a bunch of myth loving, fable loving, fiction loving idiots kind of deal was their attitude. Well, declaring yourself to be the science apparently is a dangerous thing to do in these days because it's inevitably going to come back and bite you in the rear end. And so it did when
Fauci.
Yep. And for Dawkins, it wasn't that long before, the trans movement takes off. Ironically, the same movement that Peterson's opposition to launches him to the forefront. Well, this trans movement is occurring, and Dawkins pins a criticism of it, saying that this is unscientific, to which the number one response to him was, no, you're unscientific, and you're just relying on your old, outdated dogmas, which, for us Christians sitting back observing this sort of on the front row of the pews, right, we're just going, this is so funny. I couldn't have written this in my worst fan fiction. Right. And the thing is, when he says this and the world comes back to him and says, no, you're anti-science, something clearly has changed in the world. Right. The mapping of the intellectual world is not the same, such that the new atheist claims can even just be the way that they are. Because even still, Dawkins presented his critique of the trans movement as exactly his critique that he gave of the Holy Spirit in the God Delusion. It's almost beat for beat the same criticism. And so in the God Delusion, he's celebrated, and in this one, he's called unscientific. It's hilarious. But clearly, something has changed in between. Well, into this changing landscape, Peterson steps with his ideas. And what he's pointing to your point, the new atheists were this eroding kind of, let's tear down the Christian narratives that have founded culture and that had established the West, is essentially their approach. Well, Peterson steps in saying, hey, we need to preserve these narratives. We don't just need to preserve these narratives. We need to learn from these narratives. We need to value them and value them fundamentally. And so when he steps in and starts saying this isn't something that's new. His first book, Maps of Meaning, was published in 1999. Right. So this is a whole 17 years before he blows up on the world stage for saying these things. And a lot of the stuff that he's been saying ever since is already found entirely in Maps of Meaning. For those people who've read Maps of Meaning, his major points that show up throughout the rest of his authorship so far are really echoing what he said there. And the thing about this is that book opens up with this lamentation in the preface, the introduction, I believe. He gives sort of a existential or pathos-filled recounting of his youth. And there he says that he grew up, under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation from the Cold War. He also grew up in a world wherein it's constantly and progressively being demythologized. There is no meaning to life. And precisely what the new atheists were trying to do in their positive project, give you some orientation for life, well, it had already failed by Peterson's youth. So before the new atheist even emerged on the scene, that aspiration had failed. And so he's well aware of this. And he's recognizing that something needs to be changed. The world doesn't have to be this broken. And so he's thinking, if something needs to be changed and we can fix the world in some way, how do we do this? And he's noting that, well, we've eroded and destroyed the very mechanisms whereby meaning comes to be incorporated within the human life world or Lebenswelt. And so he's trying to recover the mechanisms that produce meaning in the world. And this just strikes a chord in 2016 and 2017 and 2018 when he's showing up. That people, I think, are not only fed up with the new atheists, but also we're kind of fed up on a political level with the erosion of every political value that we've been raised with. And not only that we've been raised with, but which we have been using to order our lives ever since. And so there's this kind of trend that's occurring. One of the best ones, I think, is in literally the first page of this book by Douglas Murray, wherein he, if I can read it real quick, I think he just puts it really nicely and precisely. He says, here we go. Then, over the last century, the secular hopes held out by all political ideologies began to follow in religion's wake. In the latter part of the 20th century, we entered the postmodern era, an era which defines itself and was defined by its suspicion toward all grand narratives. However, as all school children learn, nature abhors a vacuum, and into the postmodern vacuum, new ideas began to creep with the intention of providing explanations and meanings of their own. It was inevitable that some pitch would be made for the deserted ground. People in wealthy Western democracies today could not simply remain the first people in recorded history to have absolutely no explanation for what we were doing here and no story to give life its purposes. Whatever else they lacked, the grand narratives of the past at least gave life meaning. And so what we're seeing, and what Peterson also kind of brings to the fore, is that in truth, there never was just simply the removal of one meta-narrative so that we could be freed from meta-narratives. It's always the removal of one meta-narrative to replace it with another. And with that replacement, he's essentially highlighting that the new narratives that are replacing the old ones are narratives against themselves. These myths earlier are supposed to build the foundation by which we can construct life worlds that can orient us and give us purpose and so forth, and through which we can build civilization. But these new worlds are worlds that are built on the destruction of the old world, essentially. And so they're worlds against themselves. And so even the kind of distorted meaning given that they give you is going to be something like, you find meaning in your activism wherein you tear down a world. And so it's this kind of activism against itself, this meaning against itself. And so if we are, in Peterson's view, I think, sort of concretizations of our worlds, that we are born into a world and we become sort of microcosms of this world, we reflect that kind of internal turmoil, then that means in the same degree that this world is tearing itself apart, so too will we. And so the goal is to then reorder our lives, discover the principles by which true meaning, true order can be achieved, and to bring those back into our lives and order ourselves appropriately.
Yeah, great summary. Good job setting the stage there for the circumstances that allowed for Peterson's meteoric rise to fame in the Western world. I personally have to say, I really like Jordan Peterson. It's hard not to. He has an attractive, winsome, sincere style of communication. The man is clearly brilliant.
Yeah.
He's courageous. He's not afraid to tell it like he sees it. He's endured in a public way some real hardship and suffering, and he's been able to overcome that. There was that whole year or so where he fell out of the public purview and he struggled with some psychological issues, and he rebounded from that and came back stronger than ever. So there's a lot to like about the man. Where I really appreciate Peterson is in his role as a critic of Western culture. I feel like he's an ally against those pernicious ideologies that threaten our society today, like nihilism and postmodernism and cultural Marxism, scientism, and even radical environmentalism. So I also appreciate Peterson and what he has done to draw attention to the Bible. I think it's no exaggeration to say that Peterson is obsessed with Scripture. He has a genuine and deep respect for Christianity, and I think even a kind of reverence for Scripture. So it's just really refreshing to me to see a public intellectual who approaches the Bible with a sincere intent to understand it. And we can talk about how, and we're going to talk about how he understands it, but at the very least, I think you and I would agree, Peterson is sincere. He truly wants to come to Scripture and learn from it. And that is just so refreshing because, we're used to, in our post-religious secular era, we're used to the public intellectuals in approaching Scripture only with the intent to criticize. So I think it's really refreshing. But here my feelings about Peterson are mixed, because he's done a lot of good for Christianity, but I also think he's the source of some serious confusion when it comes to understanding the Bible, and which is one of the primary reasons and motivations you and I wanted to do this series. So all that to say, for me, Peterson is kind of like a mixed bag. I think a good analogy of the way that I assess the Peterson phenomenon is like a prescription you might take for something, for some debilitating illness, right? So you take this medication and it does a fairly good job of treating certain aspects of the illness, but then it comes with all these troublesome side effects. So this is kind of the way I see Peterson. He is, in a sense, a good antidote for some of our society ills, the ills of our society, right? For some of the intellectual sickness that has gripped the Western world. He definitely is great for the Western society and culture, but he comes with baggage, especially when it comes to his interpretation of Scripture, as we will be pointing out. And so you just have to have discernment and you have to be careful. Anything else you want to say, just as an introduction to Peterson himself?
Yeah, well, actually, one is a kind of an irony based off of what you just said. In one of the more controversial passages that comes out of this book, and when I say controversial, I mean it's obviously true, but the left has problematized it. He calls Jacques Derrida the leader of the postmoderns, which that's because if we talk about postmodernism, you probably think of two people first, and that's going to be Derrida and Foucault. So, whether he accepted it or not, which Derrida did not, doesn't matter. But Derrida has this wonderful resurrection of the term pharmakon in his writings, and the term pharmakon is to say that we get our word pharmacy from it, but it's to say that there's a kind of a good treatment that comes from it, but it always comes with a little bit of poison too, right? There's this kind of dual nature to all of these different solutions. So that, like with the example, it comes from Plato, and the example Plato gives is that, or Socrates gives rather, is he's against writing things down precisely because the exteriorizing of memory onto a tablet means that the natural human function of preserving memory on our own is going to be lost. Effectively, we're exteriorizing that function to something that we're now going to let it do our job for us. And so there's a benefit in that it's a good way to preserve memory, but at the same time, there's a cost in the sense that it costs us some of our humanity. So there's a good and a bad, basically, is what the pharmakon always represents. And I think it's hilarious because you're kind of describing it in the sense of like he's a little bit of a pharmakon here.
Okay, so as I said, we're going to be working our way through We Who Wrestle with God, which, by the way, is no easy task. The book is kind of a behemoth at over 500 pages in length. Yeah, it's a big one. Now, in this episode, we'll focus on some stage setting in particular, and then we'll look at the first introductory chapter of the book. And then in episodes after this in this series, we'll start to get into the main text, where we'll look at probably a couple of chapters at a time. However, before wading into the text, I think it would be good for us to provide something of an overview or general summary of the book. It'll be helpful if we can get some idea about what Peterson is up to here. So, Andrew, I'll start with my assessment of what I take to be Peterson's general project in this book, and then we'll get your thoughts on it. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, it is very difficult for me to summarize what Peterson is doing in this book without at the same time being critical of what he's doing in this book. So here's my critical summary. In We Who Wrestle with God, Peterson walks us through various stories from the Bible with special emphasis on the first 5 books of the Old Testament, with the intent of drawing from them a specific characterization of God, a specific characterization of the divine. Essentially, this is a book about how to think about God. The subtitle of the book, after all, is Perceptions of the Divine. This is essentially what Peterson is up to. He's using the biblical text as a vehicle to present his own idiosyncratic representation of the divine. in the introduction to the book, which we'll look at shortly in more detail, he tells us that he's going to present, quote, a much more psychological and relational definition of the supreme deity, detaching God from the pagan theater of the natural world and placing him wonderfully and terribly inside us all, end quote. As this quote indicates, Peterson's perception of God is going to end up being markedly different from, and I would argue at odds with, the traditional historical understanding of God. And this is something that we'll have occasion to point out along the way in this series. To draw out his particular perception of the divine from the biblical text, Peterson will apply his own ideological hermeneutic to the text. In other words, he's going to understand and interpret the various biblical accounts from the perspective of a particular ideological framework. It's a framework that will allow him to deliver the perception of the divine that he's looking for. Now, the trouble here is that Peterson just isn't transparent about his hermeneutical project. He doesn't, in any clear or plain way, tell you what he's doing. He just starts doing it. So if you're going to understand what's going on in this book, it's absolutely critical, it seems to me, that you have to have some awareness of the ideology that's controlling Peterson's interpretation of these biblical accounts. Now, it seems abundantly evident to me that the controlling ideology at work in this book is that of analytical psychology, also sometimes referred to as Jungian analysis, after its founder, Carl Jung. Jung was a highly influential 20th century psychologist who studied for a time with Sigmund Freud, although his own thought ends up differing from Freud's in significant ways. Now, I'm not saying that analytical psychology is the only influence on Peterson in this book, but I think, as I say, it's definitely the controlling influence. So let me just take a few minutes here to unpack some of the key Jungian ideas that I think are playing a critical hermeneutical role in Peterson's book. Now, one of the ways that Jung differed from Sigmund Freud and from Friedrich Nietzsche, by the way, who he was also greatly influenced by, is that Jung believed in the existence of universal and objective human values and meaning. But unlike the Christian view, which, by the way, Christianity was another major influence on Jung's thinking, unlike the Christian view, which ultimately grounds objective and universal values in God, Jung grounded them in the deep structure of human consciousness, or in what he called the psyche. So by means of this psyche, which is universal to all humans, we're able to construct a hierarchy of values by which we can morally order and orient our lives. Now, by this term psyche, Jung meant something like the entirety of all mental and brain processes. So the psyche includes the conscious aspect of our mental experience, but importantly, it also includes the unconscious aspect of our mental life as well. So the psyche is the whole of a person's mental experience, both conscious and unconscious. Now, when Peterson deploys this term in his book, and he uses this term everywhere, it's important to understand that he has this Jungian meaning of the word psyche in mind. And according to Jung, within every individual human psyche, there is what he called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a part of the human psyche, the unconscious part, that contains universal patterns of thought and behavior that are shared by all humans. And these universal patterns of thought and behavior in the unconscious part of the psyche have been passed down to us through our ancestral lineage. And you can think of this collective unconscious as something like an inherited set of pre-existent forms or structures of consciousness that exist deep within that unconscious part of our human psyches, and which are universally shared across all individuals of the human species and across all cultures and across all times. And Jung believed that these universal patterns of thought and behavior have existed in the human psyche from the beginning, from the very moment that humans became a differentiated species in the deep past. This Jungian idea that there are these deep evolutionary primitive layers and structures underlying our conscious awareness is something that Peterson clearly endorses. Now, Jung also believed that as individual human beings, we are all striving for psychological balance and growth by integrating different parts of our psyche with one another. So for Jung, the psyche is a kind of a self-regulating system that is constantly seeking balance, constantly seeking fulfillment and wholeness between opposing forces at work with within our own consciousness. And Jung believed that each one of us are on a kind of individual journey, a journey of transformation in life. And we're striving to become whole, to become integrated persons in a process that he called individuation. Jung believed that this journey that we're all on is in some sense spiritual, and that the expression of this journey is at the mystical heart of all religions. So religion for Jung is fundamentally, and I would say this is true for Peterson too, fundamentally a practical road to individuation. Religion is a means to psychological wholeness and fulfillment for both the individual person and for a society made up of individual persons. In fact, let me say this. I'm convinced that this idea of wrestling with God in the mind of Peterson is ultimately meant to signal this Jungian struggle for individuation, the struggle for psychological wholeness and integration and fulfillment within the individual consciousness, but also within society at large. Okay, we're almost there. There is one more very important element of Jung's and Peterson's thought that we need to be aware of, and that is the idea of the archetype. Jung believed that human beings have the unique ability to express the underlying structures of the collective unconscious through symbolic representation, manifested primarily in human drama or in story. And Jung calls these symbolic representations of the deep universal psyche archetypes. And the idea here is that from the beginning of the human species, there have been recurring motifs and themes or archetypes that have been expressed in every generation and in every culture through the vehicle of drama and story, and especially in religious and mythological drama and story and literature. And some of these alleged archetypes have been identified and even given names. So, for example, we see some of these being mentioned by Peterson himself in this book later in chapter 1. We see him referred to the archetypes of, for example, the dragon of chaos, or the great mother, or the great father, and so on. These are Jungian archetypes. Now, for Jung and for Peterson, these archetypes are very important because, as I said, they are expressions of the very source of objective meaning and value for us as a species. Remember, for Jung, it's the psyche that is the source of objective meaning and value. And in his book, Peterson at one point even says that our conscience is eternally attempting to reveal truth to us, and that the echoes of this revelation of conscience are heard most fundamentally in the drama of Scripture, in the drama of the Bible, which is why Peterson is so interested in Scripture. So archetypes, then, are critical for Jung and for Peterson in the striving for and in the journey of individuation, for the pursuit of psychological and societal wholeness and fulfillment. And Jung thought that there's tremendous benefit for us as individuals and for society as a whole to study the great dramas, especially the religious ones. And for Peterson, this is especially true of the biblical drama, of the biblical stories. We do this so as to bring those aspects of the collective unconscious or the deep psyche to bear on our conscious awareness. And to the degree that we can be consciously aware of these deep patterns of thought and behavior, to that degree can we consciously and willfully align our lives with them and live according to them, and thereby achieve an integrated and whole state of consciousness, both individually and again as a society. In preparation for this series, I went back and actually listened to Peterson's lecture that he did on Carl Jung from 2015, and listen to how Peterson himself, in his own words, describes what Jung was up to. And I quote, "What Jung was really trying to do was to resurrect deep religious representations from the dead, so to speak, and make them conscious so people could align themselves with them again," end quote. Now this, I submit, is exactly what Peterson is doing in We Who Wrestle with God. In my opinion, he's continuing this Jungian project by mining the biblical text for archetypes of the collective unconscious, so that he can place before our conscious awareness a perception of the divine that is within us, so that we can align ourselves with it and achieve psychological and societal wholeness and fulfillment. All right. So that's my long-winded critical summary of what I think is basically going on in this book and the background ideological framework that is controlling Peterson's interpretation of Scripture. And I'm not saying that this is the only thing that's happening in this book, but it seems to me to be the main thing. So, Andrew, sorry for that long explanation, but let me kick it to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought that was excellent. In terms of your opening statement about he's never really terribly clear about his hermeneutical approach. Just for the audience out there, there's a book by Word on Fire Institute, Jordan Peterson, God and Christianity, and the opening article in this one is it is on a Christian response to the biblical series. Quite literally, I think you were listening to the Old Testament series that he did, and so there is the opening chapter of that first part of the book has a section on how Peterson reads the Bible, and he gives a pretty nice little hermeneutic that I think I can break it down probably better for a future episode for at least length time. But it's a very good book if anybody's interested in it, and it's very well done. Word on Fire Press they do a lot of great stuff. In terms of as well with this Jungian approach, one of the things that I think, to sort of take it out of the higher terminology into a little bit of more of an everyday type discourse, one of the things that I think this really gets at is the role of narrative constituting our behavior. And that's essentially really what he emphasizes again and again and again. And this, again, goes back to his first book, Maps of Meaning. You don't even actually have to read that far. I think it's the opening chapter of this one, that he really wants to try to prevent us from it's page 9 of that book, that he wants to prevent us from reducing the world to a merely scientific approach. And now this gets into a little bit of a philosophical disagreement that goes unstated between him and a whole lot of the philosophy that goes on in our day. And so what he states, I think it'll be best to start here, is he states a defense of myth. So mythos in Greek just means narrative. It's the plot of a play. And so myth, as he writes, is not primitive proto-science. It is a qualitatively different phenomenon. Science might be considered a description of the world with regard to those aspects that are consensually apprehensible, or another definition, a specification of the most efficient mode of reaching an end, given a defined end. But myth can be more accurately regarded as a description of the world as it signifies for action. The mythic universe is the place to act, not a place to perceive. Myth describes things in terms of their unique, shared, affective valences, their values, and their motivational significances. And so one of the things that's pretty key in that is he's influenced by, among other people as well, Martin Heidegger. And one of the things about Peterson is a lot of times he gets criticized for not dotting every I and crossing every T when he presents somebody else's ideas. And that's pretty common for original thinkers, people who are sort of an original synthesis of ideas collected from all over. And so with Heidegger, that would be one of those places where you can criticize perhaps like his Heideggerian influence, but he's not trying to be a Heideggerian. He's incorporating something, broadly speaking, from Heidegger into his thought. And so Heidegger breaks down the world in terms of ontic, ontological, and a fundamental ontology. And what really is important here is ontic really just points to the beings of any particular science. So in astrology, for example, you would have planets, galaxies, suns, stars, things like that. Those would be the beings, they'd be ontically constituting the science. The ontology, though, is going to be talking about the notion of being proper to that science. And then the fundamental ontology is asking, yeah, but what constitutes that? What's the being of beings, right? And Peterson is pointing to the point that science itself can only talk about beings, i.e., the ontic notion of things, once they've already been picked out of the world. Once we've already designated this as a being, like once we already have stars operating within our worlds, then we can talk about them as scientific objects to be explored and unpacked and uncovered, right? And through which we can understand what they mean. And so given that these things have to already be picked out of the world, well, what is prior to science that picks them out, that orders them in some way through it that allows us to be able to talk about them? Well, that's going to be myth. It's going to be narrative. And so you don't even have objects for Peterson until you have a narrative in which to frame them. And so imagine how catastrophic it would be then to have these worlds that are literally unworldly, you could put it, right? Like the worlds of today, these worlds that are destroying meta narratives, what they are attacking is the very thing that is necessary for us to not just act. It's not just that he's wanting us to have these worlds so that we can be ethical. It's so that we can do anything at all. And he stresses that again and again, that the point is you cannot even act in a truly nihilistic world. Something is always operating in there, some narrative that's giving you a ability to pick out objects and act in response to them and in relation to them. And so the idea, for example, of science destroying myth that sort of pervaded the post-war consensus of the 20th century and the early 21st century up and sort of came to its zenith in this new atheist movement, right? That whole thing is essentially eroding quite literally its own foundation. It has to have the myth if it's then to be able to build into some kind of scientific understanding. We have to first have these objects narratively constituted before we can pick them out to study them scientifically. The ontic rests on the ontological, right? And so Peterson's point there, I think it's a highly philosophically contentious point because obviously there's debates between realists, idealists, and so forth. And he's going to fall more on the idealist side of things, not directly, but it's still, if I had to say one or the other, he falls more on the idealist kind of things, side of things, because he views objects as mediated fundamentally by these narratives.
Yeah, and it almost sounds Kantian when he's talking about these narratives and the way story structures our perceptions. It almost sounds Kantian to me.
Very much so. I think absolutely. When you were describing the archetypes, that's of course one of those big frictional points between Jung and a lot of other psychoanalytic thinkers. Precisely because if you go to somebody like Lacan, there is no one. He's not going to use the term myth, but he's going to use just like the symbolic is what he's going to talk about. And there's no one symbolic order. Essentially, there's multiple different kinds of discourses that can occur in this. So the thing is, with Lacan, there isn't this one universal thing. There are universal roles. We are all playing signifying roles and whatnot, but there's not a narrative that we're fitting into. These archetypes don't operate in the same way. So there's a kind of staticness to this Jungian notion that properly maps over, like you're saying, this Kantian idea of a
and just so people understand, Jung did not think that, and Peterson does not think that the narrative. He thinks that there's a proper narrative, that there's a proper story into which we are supposed to fit. He doesn't think that the story's up for grabs. He's definitely against that postmodern idea. There is an objective story, and to the extent that we can become aware of that story, to that extent we can align ourselves with it and flourish as psychological beings.
And one thing, a caveat with the flourishing point, I've seen a lot of critics that'll say that Peterson, that he is kind of a self-help guru who is just trying to teach us how to be happy and how to be complete. And Peterson's pretty clear, I think, in this, and especially in the opening. He has a section where he says, here we go. On page 20 or XX, the Roman numeral 20 of the preface, he says that I had to learn finally that the terrible aspect of life might actually be a necessary precondition for the existence of life, and that this is possible and that it is possible to regard that this precondition, in consequence, as comprehensible and acceptable. In other words, his well-ordered life does not in any way remove the struggles that are natural to life. Rather, it harmonizes itself with struggle, if you will. So within that, is it time for us to jump into the text itself?
Yeah, I mean, we can just roll right into the introductory chapter, which he titles "Foreshadowing: The Still Small Voice." So this is a good way just to proceed right into how Peterson himself sets up the text.
Yeah. So there's a number of things when we approach, for example, let's keep that science and myth distinction in mind here. When we approach Genesis 1, there has been a trend for a very long time, at least since the Enlightenment, to try to interpret Genesis 1 as giving us a kind of ontic account of how the world came into being, right? And so there will be a lot of apologists, for example, that'll try to link it with some kind of cosmological argument or Kalam cosmological argument, to use William Lane Craig's notion, right? And so what it's pointing to is there's a biblical scholar by the name of John Walton in these two books. He gives us a nice distinction between what he calls the functional ontology, which is going to be more of a mythical ontology, and what he calls the material ontology, which is kind of the ex nihilo type thing. Now, that needs a little bit more unpacking. I imagine for the audience, that's anything but clear at this point. And so the thing is, if we are talking about, how did the universe come into being in terms of a science, in most of the sciences, what we're talking about is, as Peterson himself referred to, these things are ordered to some kind of an end, right? And unfortunately, in the present day, most of the sciences are ordered towards some kind of technological utilization, right? And so the human body is studied, for example, so that then we can, in a sense, in a technological sense, manufacture cures for maladies and so forth. We can understand how to grow it so that it's stronger, can perform its tasks better, right? It's not that we study man as a rational animal anymore. We study man as something to be put into some mode of production. And I'm going to actually, ironically here, use a little bit of Marx's language that he calls these the different modes of life in the opening of the German ideology. Marx, unfortunately, never liked giving us definitions to his terms. He loved using them all the time, never defined them. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds like Peterson.
Yeah, right, right. And so the thing is, there's only one place I'm aware of where he really actually gives us like some definitions, or kind of gives us definitions, and that's the opening of the German ideology. And what he essentially says there is that what he calls a mode of life is going to be that the means of not just continuing life, like the means of producing food and whatnot, the necessary things for continuing life, these things come together and we're born into the system wherein this way of sustaining life is operating. And these different ways of sustaining life, these modes of life, just change over time. And culture gets incorporated into this. And all the different machinations of what anthropologists are going to study gets incorporated into these modes of life as sort of a concretized form. And so when we're born into these sorts of things, unfortunately, the governance of a mode of life is going to be technology, right? Technology is the means by which we sustain, by which we produce the not just the things we enjoy, but food, right? The things we need, right? Darwin talks about it in The Descent of Man, wherein that it's by means of technology that we can enter into a particular area that's inhospitable to us and that would normally kill us. And rather than us changing with the environment, which is the traditional mechanism of evolution, we change the environment to our needs. And so it's that ability to change the environment to our needs through this sort of mode of life that technologizes the world. The world ends up being perceived in a scientific lens only through the lens of utilization. Immanuel Kant, to go back to him, has this wonderful passage in a sort of satirical piece wherein he imagines a person coming up to a sheep and he says, you have this wool, but I only understand wool through the lens of this would be great to turn into a jacket for me, right? So we understand the sheep through the lens of it's being used for my good, right? And so there's a difference between a thing in the Thomistic vocabulary, which is the extramental, the thing outside the mind, and it's being in a way totally disconnected from the mind, and an object, which is to stand before. To be an object is to stand before another. And so the only kind of existence that Peterson is talking about is objective existence. And within the realm of objective existence, we can talk about things in this scientific lens, which is always going to be ordered to some sort of means of production, right? It's always going to be some sort of technologization, essentially, that we are technologizing the things. The sciences don't really study being qua being, they study being qua its utilization for our purposes, some kind of imposed teleology. And there's a medieval axiom, Aquinas talks about this, for example, which I like to summarize as just form follows telos, which is, to break down the technical vocabulary, that's just to say that what a thing is follows what it is to become, right? The order of causes is such that the end cause determines the nature of the thing. And so if that's the case, well, the end cause of the sciences is going to be technologization, in which case the form that will be discovered in these things, in these objects, is always ordered toward that technologized form. Well, the problem is, of course, to go back to this hierarchy for Peterson, objects also have a mythical quality here. And so if we ask the question of Genesis 1, what are you communicating? From the perspective of a technologized science, you will have all of the debates unfold about essentially, the Kalam cosmological argument, the Big Bang, is God needed, is God not needed for that? Those kinds of scientific debates are what's going to follow from that. But what if the Bible's not even talking in that register? In Walton's terms, Walton calls that the material ontology. Philosophically, I wish he'd use a different term, but we kind of get what he means by that. It's this technologized ontology here, right? So Walton calls it a material ontology. But what if it's actually a functional ontology? Now, functional might sound like it fits in with this technologizing ontology, but what it means here in a sort of Petersonian terms is that what's being communicated is not a sort of mechanistic type thing. How did the cosmos come into being? Because how does that even link up with the rest of what happens in Genesis? It doesn't even really make sense there. But rather, it's to say that what is being communicated is a purpose, an ordering of the cosmos to God's purposes. In a sense, it's to say, well, there's a different level of purposing going on here, not that's disconnected from our technologizing purposing and is fundamentally connected to a narrative that God is telling us. And this narrative that God is telling us then is what Peterson wants to unpack. And there's an important point here. This is actually one of my favorite commentators on John Calvin, is a guy by the name of Paul Helm. He's got a book, John Calvin's Ideas. And he writes something that I think is incredibly important that might help sort of clarify a little bit of what I've been going on about. And that is that he says that he's kind of defending the idea of natural theology here. And he says that we've approached it kind of wrongly. We've approached the cosmological arguments, the five ways, and all those kinds of things kind of wrongly for a while. And he says, as a background to attempting to estimate what Calvin's attitude toward natural theology was, it has to be borne in mind that there is an increasing trend in current scholarship to distinguish between medieval natural theology and the evidentialist natural theology of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment periods. Thomas Aquinas is no longer automatically read through Enlightenment eyes. Instead, his natural theology is regarded as being internal to his Christian theology, a case of faith seeking and gaining understanding, rather than a necessary prolegomenon to faith. Let me stress that part. Rather than a necessary prolegomenon to faith. Natural theology is possible, but not necessary for a rational and certainty for the faith. Now, here's the thing. If I'm trying to prove God's existence, and that's why I turned to Genesis 1, Walton would argue from a functional ontology perspective, it's assuming that God exists. And it's now trying to talk about what's his purpose in creating, right? But if we're talking about it in terms of, if we're talking about in terms of a prolegomenon to faith, then we end up with these things that don't necessarily tell us anything about God. Now, you and I know that when we turn to Aquinas, for example, there's his book, De Ente et Essentia, on being in essence. And in that book, there's what we might call a cosmological argument presented. And this cosmological argument, though, it's debated among Thomist scholars, was Aquinas giving us an argument? Because if that's an argument right there, it's not a very good argument. At least it's not a well presented argument. He gives it better in other volumes. Here, it just seems like it's a metaphysical principle that he's outlining, right? And that's kind of the difference here that we're talking about. Is this an argument or is it just a principle? If it's an argument, then it's trying to establish that God exists. If it's a principle, it's a means by which we can understand him, right? And that's that latter point that is really at issue here. Is this something that's telling us how to understand God, right? Understand God and his purposes. Now, this connects with Peterson in a big way in the opening, right? Because in the opening, he uses a phrase that I think is very telling of where he's going. And he says, here we go. He says that he's looking for, quote, the most fundamental characterizations or definitions of God. Notice that characterization here is used as a synonym for definition. If you're talking about God in an ontic sense, one proper to the sciences, definition and characterization could not be the same. If you're talking about him in terms of a functional ontology or a mythic sense, then characterization, who he is in the narrative, is exactly the definition that he is. I'm drinking from my Aragorn mug right now that I got from Burger King back in 2001. It seemed appropriate to the Return of the King to talk about Peterson with. And so Aragorn, if you talk about the definition of Aragorn here, right, are we talking about the definition of him in terms of he's a man, he's technically a Numenorian or descendant from the Numenorians, so that means he has a longer lifespan? Or are we talking about the guy who is to become king, the character who is to become king? If we say that Tolkien, with the descriptions of Aragorn that he gives, was ordering towards proving to us that a man named Aragorn existed and that he was a man, but that he had exceptionally long life, we've kind of missed the point of the Return of the King. But if we refer to Aragorn instead as the character here, as the man who is destined to restore justice to the world by taking upon him the mantle of kingship, by restoring what was broken in the world, that's suddenly the better definition. We properly grasp what Tolkien was trying to communicate. So with that kind of a distinction in mind, Peterson approaches Genesis 1 here, and then of course he turns into the story with Elijah. Yeah, he turns to Elijah, and he through the lens of God, not as understood in an ontic sense, not as understood in a scientific sense, but is utterly indifferent from that. Rather, it's from a narrative sense of what is the character of God revealed.
Yeah, you're a lot more charitable than I am. Your analysis, that was very deep, penetrating. I see what Peterson's up to kind of being worn on his sleeve. So in this foreshadowing chapter, again, he calls it Foreshadowing the Still Small Voice. Basically, Peterson's going to have some reflections specifically on the story of Elijah in 1st and 2nd Kings. He gets into Genesis more, into chapter 1 and chapter 2, when he starts to look at the story of Adam and Eve and the creation of the universe. But in the foreshadowing chapter in particular, he wants to focus on Elijah. And he draws from this story insights that he'll use to interpret and understand the meaning of biblical accounts that he'll be considering in the rest of the book, including in those early chapters of Genesis. So here's my critical summary, all right? And it's probably less charitable than what you just presented. I think that Peterson interprets the story of Elijah through that ideological lens that I was talking about earlier, this Jungian analysis. And then he draws out from this ideological interpretation of principles that will then guide his interpretation of the Bible in the rest of the book. And naturally, those principles just turn out to be Jungian principles through and through. So listen to what he says here in this foreshadowing chapter, page 25, I think. He says, quote, "The biblical texts and their characterization of God simply cannot be understood in the absence of appreciation for Elijah's unparalleled significance as a prophet, and for the vital importance of his transformative and revolutionary realization Now, I would submit that the transformative and revolutionary realization that he's talking about is just the Jungian reading of the story that he does. And then he goes on, quote, "After encountering the story of Elijah, we perceive the nature of being ours and that of the divine," end quote. So I think that what he's doing is he is impregnating the story and the account of Elijah with a Jungian analysis. And then he's drawing out of the story of Elijah that those Jungian principles that he impregnated the text with in the first place. And then he's going to use those principles to understand the nature of God and understand human nature at the same time. And so I think that the story of Elijah is something like a canvas in this foreshadowing chapter, where Peterson's painting this Jungian perception of the divine into the biblical account. And then, like I said, then he uses that picture to control the interpretation of the biblical text going forward. And I could draw this out. I think there are lots and lots of echoes in this foreshadowing chapter of the Jungian analysis. There's all kinds of terms of art that he drops that are straight out of Jung. He looks at the Bible, the biblical accounts, as representative or symbolic, he says, of the psyche's capacity for qualitative and revolutionary transmutation. That's a quote from him there in the foreshadowing chapter. He identifies all of these symbolic tropes or archetypes within the narrative of Elijah and other stories as well from the Old Testament. And what is the key? He keeps talking about this key revelation that he thinks the story of Elijah gives us. What is that key revelation? Well, I would argue that the key revelation that he gets from Elijah has to do with the characterization of the divine. It has to do with the nature of God. And I agree with you that Peterson's not approaching the text as a philosopher. He's not approaching the text as a theologian, and he's not approaching the text as a philosopher. He's not looking, like you said, for a philosophical or even a theological definition of God. He's doing something else, but I think he is in the process identifying the nature of God. I do think that's happening in the text. So, and before we maybe we can move to exactly how Peterson characterizes the nature of the divine here. That sets the stage for the rest of this book. But I mean, what are your thoughts about that? Like, I don't have the background reading that you have in Peterson or in these influences on Peterson's thought, but from the background knowledge that I do have of analytical psychology and listening to lectures from Peterson and in interviews, I feel like that's exactly what's happening here. And I feel like, although he doesn't come out and tell us plainly and clearly, hey, I'm going to do a Jungian analysis of the story of Elijah and then use that as the basis for understanding the rest of the biblical text that we're going to look at. He doesn't come out and say that. It just seems to me that's clearly what he's doing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't really actually want to disagree really at all with your take there. I do agree. My purpose before was not to disagree so much as to just add another layer to it. And the thing is, with his definition of God, once we have the idea that the type of definition we're looking for, it's not an ontic one, but rather it's this kind of mythic one, right? Once we have that in mind, he gives us two definitions of God here, like two characterizations of God in the chapter. He says there's going to be more, and there are going to be more. Each chapter kind of introduces a new one. And so there definitely are new or several definitions, but God is always a character in the story. And he is revealing himself as a character in the story relative to us. He's always got this kind of objective existence. And I mean, I don't know if I don't want to jump ahead too far. To my mind, the two definitions that he gives us is that God is, first of all, the conscience within us. He's the voice, the still small voice. And that he says that twice. It's on Roman numeral page 24 and page 30 that he says that. For if you don't read Roman numerals, it's the XXIV for 24 and then XXX. So, and then for God as the calling as well is the second definition he gives, and that's on Roman numeral 30 that he gives that statement. And so these two ideas are, I think, the fundamental first characterizations that he's building atop. And I'm a little bit conflicted on the God as conscience point, because part of how he got there, um, I really liked his reading all of a sudden. But then it's amazing that there are some places where if you look into the table of contents, he almost never cites a theologian. It's always psychologists such as you're talking
That's
about.
right.
Some randomly, as I mentioned before, one of the early ones is Daniel Dennett, which is
Yeah.
hilarious. A new atheist gets cited, and so it's amazing when he does nevertheless overlap with a bunch of contemporary. Well, go ahead. Yeah, it looks like you had
No, I
something
was
to
just
say.
laughing because he does cite a theologian, and
Yeah,
that's Cardinal Newman. Now,
yep.
what I think is funny about that is he totally misinterprets what Cardinal Newman is saying.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. So he's cagey. Okay, this is Jordan Peterson. When you listen to him, he's cagey. I don't think he's deliberately trying to be cagey. I think this is just the way his mind is working, and I think he is thinking through an ideological framework that is really complex and complicated, and so it makes him difficult to follow. So what's going on? He's working from the story of Elijah here, right? But there's a specific point. There's a specific part of the story that he's really focused on.
Yeah.
And so we have this famous story of Elijah. He confronts the prophets of Baal, right? Calls down fire from God. God consumes the altar. The prophets of Baal are killed. It's just this triumphant moment for Elijah, right? And Elijah goes back into the city, and then Jezebel, the evil queen of Israel, threatens Elijah's life. And what happens? Elijah runs. He flees. He ends up fleeing into the wilderness. He ends up at Mount Sinai. He ends up in a cave. And he's basically scared. He ran, and he's ashamed. He's ashamed that he was scared and he ran. I mean, after all, he's just called down fire from heaven, and now this woman threatens him, and he runs, right? It's a really interesting story. And by the way, Peterson has some deep insights into it that I think are really good. But anyway, so what happens? So God comes to Elijah. But before this happens, there is a great wind, but God is not in the wind. And then there's a great earthquake, but God is not in the earthquake. And then there's a great fire, but God is not in the fire. And then Elijah hears a whisper, right? A still small voice, which is the subtitle of this foreshadowing chapter. That is where God is for Elijah. That's the voice of God, this still small comforting voice. And Peterson grabs hold of that, and he says, this particular little part of the story of Elijah offers, he says, the fundamental characterization or definition of God. And that is that God is like the conscience. And Peterson uses language that identifies God with the conscience. He doesn't just say that God, this is a metaphor for God or a simile. No, he says God is the conscience, the conscience of man.
He doesn't say that God is operating in the conscience either.
That's right.
I want to say that because, I mean, like, in case it might be that somebody tries to preserve some of what he's saying, it's not even that God is operating through the conscience. He is the conscience.
He is. Let me read the quote just so people can believe this here. This is on the page 24 of this foreshadowing chapter. He says, from this passage, from this story of Elijah, we find out that God is, quote, something within, the voice of conscience itself, the internal guide to what is right and wrong, that autonomous spirit that resides in each soul and shames us before ourselves, draws attention to our shortcomings and sins, and generates the impulse to repent, apologize, and atone. End quote. Later on in the next passage, he explicitly says he's identifying God with the conscience. And then he goes on to cite Cardinal Newman in support of this. But the thing that's funny is the passage that he cites from Cardinal Newman is not agreeing with him. Cardinal Newman is not saying that consciousness is God and God is consciousness. Rather, what he's saying is consciousness is a reflection of the law of God. It's a reflection of the law of God. It's the law of God as understood by the intellect. That's what Cardinal Newman is saying. I laugh because the one time he does quote a theologian, he completely misquotes or completely misunderstands what Newman is saying there. He is not agreeing with Peterson here. So, and I agree with you, like, Peterson's going to go on and he doesn't just identify God with conscience. He's going to go on and say that God not only manifests as conscience, but also manifests as inspiration, as adventure, as enthusiasm, as in curiosity, and even, he says, temptation.
Yeah.
So what's happening? So none of these things identify God. They're all characteristic of a God that is internal to us. And what he's going to end up identifying God as, I would argue, is something like the upward striving. This is a phrase he uses, the upward striving that exists within the collective unconscious of the human psyche. There is this thing inside of us, collectively and universally, that is pulling us up, pulling us towards wholeness, pulling us towards integration, pulling us towards individuation. Peterson literally says, quote, God is the spirit that leads up, right? Yeah. And he manifests himself in our consciousness and leads us to fulfillment and wholeness psychologically as individuals and as a society. So it's super cagey and hard to follow, but I don't think that there's a one-to-one correspondence between God as conscience, but rather conscience is one of these manifestations of God as the upward striving of the universal human psyche. That's what God is for Peterson. And I've made my way through the first, 25% of the book. And so far, I've not been disabused of what I think Peterson thinks about God. Now, he equivocates at places. And even in recent interviews, he seems to talk in more of a traditional Christian way. Now, of course, the traditional Christian view of God is not that he's some aspect of the collective unconscious, that he's the universal abstract aspect of human consciousness itself, and the structure of human consciousness. These are all
or the moral law.
Or the moral law. These are all Jungian ideas, right? No, the classical Christian view is that God is the transcendent being itself, that is responsible for the existence of everything that is not himself. He brings everything into existence. And it doesn't exist as part of him, it exists external to him. He's the efficient cause of creation. And I would submit, this is not Jordan Peterson's understanding of God. Not in this book. It is not. And maybe he'll equivocate and float over at times into that idea of the divine. But so far in my reading, Peterson this is just a very classical, Carl Jung himself, was accused of being a pantheist. He was accused of being a pantheist because he believed that the divine was within. And he didn't mean that the divine was within just you or within me, but within the universal human unconscious psyche, the upward striving that lifts humanity to its fulfillment and wholeness. And to the degree that we can recognize that, and to the degree that we can align our lives with that, to that degree, can we bring salvation to the world? This is what Peterson actually says in the Foreshadowing chapter. Anyway, thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. One of the points that I think is kind of hilarious is, and he agrees so much with what contemporary evangelical theology has taught us about God. There's so many equivocations that are proper to contemporary evangelical theology.
Yeah, good point.
And I have to say as well, I think that one of the many things I value about this book is that he says out loud the thing that is actually very cagey in evangelical discourse.
Yeah.
And so, in an interview that he gave with I think it was the New York Post, he straightforwardly states one of his hermeneutical assumptions, which I think is getting at what you're talking about, and it's such a great, succinct way to put it. He straight up says that all of these stories, he wants you to learn that all of these stories are about you, each of us individually, right? And now, here's the thing. I've mentioned this before in our past episodes, that at the end of every evangelical sermon, there has to be an altar call, but there also has to be the ability to summarize the, quote, practical application of the sermon. And the practical application is making it applicable to your life. And if you don't include that, there's an amazing response that evangelical Christians will give. And by the way, when I use the term evangelical, I mean it more in the sense of sort of this Christianity as filtered through a lens of modern day liberalism, essentially, like this sort of egalitarian Christianity type thing, right? The thing is, this this practical application always is making it relevant to your life, and it's only ever going to be relevant to your life insofar as it helps you build your life to this Christian ideal, whatever that is that you're working toward. Now, fundamentally, this is not Protestantism. That is not what the Protestant view of God or of Christianity or the purpose of Christianity has ever been. It's this 20th century invention. And I find it very kind of even hilarious. I know a number of presuppositionalists who love this book. Like they have their reservations that they'll say the reservations are that he's not a Christian. We know that. But then they love the book because they love all the overlaps that he has with what they're saying. And the thing is, what he states straightforwardly, that this book is actually about you, and he's trying to help you learn how the book is about you. At the end of the chapter on page 30 again, Roman numeral 30, he starts talking about all these we want things. He starts saying that we want to be the hero. We want to identify, likewise, sometimes with the villain. We want to understand things like this, all these we want passages. And this is how he's ordering the Bible to help us grasp these things that we want. And so the funny thing is, if we have these practical applications that order our understanding of the faith, well, if it has to be made practical to your life, then guess what's at the center of your theology? Your life.
Yeah, right.
Who is God? God is part of your theology. Your theology is grounded on you because it's ordered to you. You are the telos of your theology. Therefore, the form of your theology will be fundamentally ordered to you and making it relevant to your life. And that's 100% what Peterson's doing. But I can also cite a number of different theologians today who do the same thing. Now, how is this most importantly communicated? Well, one of the things that he does is he opens up with, to go back to the Jezebel passage or back to his assessment of Israel. Israel is a nation that has fallen into disarray. Why? Because it has rejected the traditional view of God. It has rejected the traditional teachings of God, moved away into some other form of teaching.
Idolatry.
Yeah. Idolatry. Yep. And look, let's hold that term idolatry there too, because the goal then is that the world has fallen to pieces, and so the goal now for the man of God is to work to put the world to rights, put the world right again, right? And I use the phrase "put the world right again" because there's another guy whose name is Wright, N.T. Wright, in fact, who defines Christianity precisely as that. If you read his book, Simply Christian, the very opening chapter is about how Christianity, I think it's even titled "Putting the World to Rights." And he says this again and again and again in his books, basically, wherein the purpose of Christianity is reordering the world back to God's ways, right? And so there's always kind of like one of the common criticisms of N.T. Wright. He usually kind of is able to duck it a little bit, but the criticism is, isn't this going to end up being a works-based salvation? It really seems like it is. With Peterson, it obviously is a works-based salvation. If you recall back to his earlier years when he was just starting to sort of flirt publicly with Christianity, he had several lines where he would say things like, I'm terrified by saying that I would be a Christian because what kind of a burden are you taking upon yourself here? And the point is, none. The burden is on Christ. That's the whole point of Christianity. Wes Huff has a great line about that at the end of the recent interview on Joe Rogan's podcast. And the point is, though, that this is fundamentally a works-based salvation model, wherein salvation is grounded in putting the world right. And so much of contemporary Christian discourse agrees with the putting the world to rights part, agrees that Christianity is ordered to putting the world to rights. It agrees even that we need to have these works. They may not say that works are necessary for salvation, but they are perfective of salvation, something like that. So they're still in some way connected with salvation. The thing that they won't say, though, is that that just is what Christianity is. And so what he's essentially doing here is making that incredibly explicit. And he's even saying that you have to ground this on this, let's use the phrase, Christian worldview here, right? The Judeo-Christian worldview, if you want, but it's still the Christian worldview, what the Bible gives us. And that then is the way by which we recover the world, by which we save the world.
Yeah.
Do you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to say that I would agree that, okay, so what Peterson is doing, I mean, he's a psychologist after all, is therapy. I think he's doing therapy here. And in that sense, yes, he's like therapeutic deism. He's like the therapeutic theism that's on display in the evangelical world. You know, there are different versions of the therapeutic within, a religious framework. But I think what differentiates Peterson, and maybe he's moving away from this a little bit based on recent interviews that I've heard, but Peterson is not, if I had to categorize Peterson, I don't think I would say he's a therapeutic deist. I don't think I would say he's a therapeutic theist. I think I'd say he's a therapeutic pantheist at this point, because God is brought down to the level of the universal, innate human psyche. That's where he's brought down to. And if Peterson was here, he'd probably say something like, that's not complicated enough. It's more complicated than that. That's the Peterson line. It's more complicated than that. And I understand it's more complicated than that. But, and maybe by the time I get to the end of We Who Wrestle with God, the book will disabuse me of this judgment. But right now, it seems like a straightforward therapeutic pantheism. Because Peterson definitely believes that there is an objective moral order. Peterson definitely believes that moral values are universal, and he identifies those with the human collective unconscious, just like Jung does. And ultimately, it seems to me that he's identifying the divine in the same way. Which is why, by the way, We Who Wrestle with God, what ultimately does this mean? Well, I think the whole book is trying to unpack this idea. That's what the whole book is about. I'm trying to unpack this perception of the divine. But at the end of the day, Peterson makes the point at the end of this foreshadowing chapter. And this goes in line with what you were saying earlier about the way perceptions and story determines the way stories and narratives determine the way we perceive our perception of reality. And so for Peterson, every decision that we make as humans, we are, in a sense, we're creating our reality with the decisions that we make. And we're creating the perception of the real, the perception of life for us. And so with every decision we make, we're either creating our worlds according to that which lifts us up, that which is divine in us, or not. So every conscious moment, in this sense, Peterson thinks that we are wrestling with the divine, that we are wrestling with God. He says, quote, at every moment of consciousness, we are fated to wrestle with God, because at every moment of our waking consciousness, we are choosing to perceive the world in a certain way and according to a certain narrative. And in that sense, we are either perceiving it with what is best in us, the divine, or not. And in that sense, we are wrestling with God. That's where he leaves me in the foreshadowing chapter. And like I said, I'm completely open to being disabused of this judgment and assessment as we move through the book. But that's where he left me. And
to kind of add to the how that kind of connects, I would still point to. I'm completely with you. I think one of the biggest problems with contemporary evangelicalism, contemporary Christianity, is that it's usually it's not just failed to, it resists thinking through its claims about God to their conclusion. And so the funny thing is, that passage you read from page 25 where it says God is within us all, it mirrors very, 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 very closely Immanuel Kant's transcendental argument that he gives. And of course, the transcendental argument's a moral argument when Kant gives it. But who are the group of people that have resurrected this idea in contemporary society or in contemporary Christendom? It's the presuppositionalists. They resurrected the transcendental argument. And one of the main problems that pops up that never gets really carried to its conclusion is that if you have a transcendental notion of God, Peterson's, by the way, the citation I'm pointing to is on page 25 of the preface. The point of a transcendental is that it is the thing that constitutes the framework of understanding that we're operating within. So it's the human understanding, and it's the transcendental is the thing that constitutes it, that structures it the way that it is, right? But the problem is you have not moved beyond human understanding. You have not moved beyond human consciousness. So if he is grasped through a transcendental movement, you haven't moved beyond the human. You are fundamentally within the human. You have just reached that which constitutes the human. And so, a
That's
transcendental
exactly
argument,
right.
even when the presuppositionalists are going to give it, is it's maybe we could have a little bit of charity for them and say that you just are using the wrong terms, but I think it really shows that insofar as it's linked to this Kantian approach, you fundamentally misunderstood how we get to God. And so when Peterson's giving a variation of the transcendental argument, it shouldn't be then surprising to us that we start finding, for example, when he talks about the Bible in 12 Rules for Life, as being just this composite of all the great wisdom of humanity. Well, it functions very much like the Christian worldview does in the presuppositionalist account. And that in and of itself should show that the funniest thing is when Peterson says that this book is about you, he also is pitching it precisely as it's about you, irrespective of whether you're a Christian. You can be an atheist and still, he says that explicitly, and still draw from this. Now, here's the thing, though, as well, that I think causes it to be particularly resonating with the contemporary world in the same way that sort of in my earlier account of how he was brought to prominence. It opens up with the kingdom in disarray. Again, this is a theme that when he opens this book, he opens it with a consideration of the world in disarray. The goal is to approach the world where time is out of joint and get time back to flowing the way it should, right? Get things back in order. And so the characterizations are, we have a bad king. We have a bad king who's deferred his authority over to a corrupting woman. You have all of these different kinds of ideas that obviously parallel in his mind, and I think in the minds of the reader, exactly the world that we're in. The opening couple of pages of that preface are this world in disarray. The goal is to fix it. So that also means that we have moved away from that proper archetypal foundation into the wrong foundation, into wrong ways of approaching life, into these unworldly ways of world making, right? And so the point is we need to return to God. So he has this point where he points to mountains, for example. This is where we meet God. This is a really, I love that he doesn't cite any theologians or biblical scholars there, because this is a point you find very commonly throughout Old Testament scholarship, that the mountain as operating in this capacity. It's a very good symbolic insight that he has. So mountains are where we meet God in a sort of symbolic sense in ancient Near Eastern literature. And however, here's the Kierkegaardian in you going to pop up. He also has this idea of sort of ascending the mountain to get there. You also have the idea of myth or the myth of Jacob's ladder that he uses essentially the same way, that this is an ascending upwards to God. Yep. And the Jacob's ladder point that he's used this for years now. So the listener should probably be pretty familiar with that usage of it. He's very well read, very, very scholarly. He knows the ancient world well. So I say this with some fear and trembling. I think he fundamentally misses the whole image of what Jacob's ladder is, though. So the thing about Jacob's ladder is, in an ancient Near Eastern understanding, it seems to me to be replete across the board. The world is typically understood as the place where things are passing away, and then there's the heavens, which are understood as the place of the eternal. Right. And he gets that, right? So we're moving out of the place where things pass away to the place of the eternal. And the thing about Jacob's ladder, though, is that we do see this exact image repeatedly throughout all the surrounding areas, the surrounding regions. One, for example, would be the story of how Nurgle, the king of the underworld, becomes, if you're a Warhammer 40,000 player, same character. So basically, that there's this character, Nurgle, this god who becomes the god of the underworld. He walks that exact same ladder, but it goes down. It goes down into the underworld. It's not simply a ladder that leads upwards. It's any ladder. It goes both ways, right? And so to go deeper into the world is to go down into the realm of death and decay and so forth. And so it's not simply there for ascending to God, to ascend to better. Right. In fact, Nurgle gets captured because he gets seduced by a woman. Now, here's the thing. That image, by the queen of the underworld, right? That image of being seduced by a woman is giving yourself over to worldly passions, to carnal passions. And in the ancient Near Eastern world, ancient literature, that universally is, you think about like Plato, right? You can either order your passions to reason, or you can have reason ordered to passions. Augustine in City of God, book 14, says that sin has warped us so that we are inverted beings, such that basically our consciousness is run by our passions, essentially. And so Nurgle is representing that as he goes down the ladder. So the fact of the matter is, the ladder is not simply a call to go upwards. It kind of represents everything in this human life. That's right. And so within that, though, I think Peterson can defend himself pretty well here and just say, well, yeah, but like, who wants to teach an ethic of going down the ladder, right? Nobody wants to teach like that. That is, admittedly, that is not the point of of the ladder there.
Right.
But it is something to be wary of with it. It's not simply an ascending point, but there's a character that Kierkegaard uses, a pseudonym that he uses, Johannes de Silentio, and not de Silentio, Johannes Climacus. And John Climacus, there's a famous painting of John Climacus from the medieval period, wherein he's ascending the ladder to heaven, or the staircase to heaven, if you will. He's going up Jacob's ladder, quite literally. And Kierkegaard is critiquing the idea that we can scale upwards to get to God, to get to this kind of divinity, to get to salvation. That it's not a simple progress of starting down here in the muck of the world, in the dying world, passing away and scaling the ladder to get to salvation. That rather, if that's the goal, we can't get there at all. That is precisely the thing that Christianity is saying. Well, since you couldn't do that, since there is no ascending the ladder, then we needed Jesus to come in the first place. So Kierkegaard uses this character of Johannes Climacus to illustrate precisely that thing. And so if I can run through just one more point, though, that his kingdom ruled by bad rulers. His point is that we have kingdoms ruled by bad rulers precisely because they have these unworlding worlds that they are given over to, these anti-narrative worlds that they give themselves over to. And the point is here, we need to recognize that God is for him, right? We need to recognize that God is this conscience, this calling to adventure, to not run from the bad things of the world and problematize anything that even acknowledges them, but rather to actually embrace the suffering of the world and use that to rightly order it all over again. And so that ends up being his main theme there. So God ends up being both the conscience and the calling precisely to adventure. And he opens up the next chapter with that point. Yeah.
So, okay, a couple of things to be aware of. Peterson is painting a portrait, giving us a picture of God, as I said, that is heavily influenced by the ideological framework that he brings to the text. We've talked about that at length now. So you have to be aware of that if you're reading this book, especially as a Christian. But then we've been talking a little bit about the concept of salvation. I think the other thing that I would say is Peterson offers us a very therapeutic understanding of the notion of salvation. He tells us that the story of Elijah, and again, I'll quote him. He says the story of Elijah is, quote, representative or symbolic of the psyche's capacity to qualitative and revolutionary transmutation. That's a mouthful. This is what he says is happening think about that. This is what he says that Elijah teaches us. The psyche has the capacity to, cause qualitative and revolutionary change all on its own. So it's by means of this divine upward striving deep within the universal psyche that we can live according to what is really good for us. It provides the objective and universal standard of value for humanity so that we can have a hierarchy of value, term of art. And since our values, and I agree with Peterson on this point, he says, since our values habituate our perception of the world, and they certainly do, I agree with him there, there's a sense in which, for Peterson, like I said, we actually construct the world that we occupy existentially. He's going to talk about this more in chapter 1. So it's through the embracing of this divine upward striving of the universal human psyche that we achieve salvation, that we bring about abundant life. And he says literally, we bring about the salvation and redemption of the world. And what does that look like? Well, it looks very therapeutic. It's a properly, and again, I'm quoting him here, it amounts to a properly structured psyche and society. That's salvation. That's salvation. When you have society and the individuals of society who are structured according to the psychological and social hierarchy of values and true moral order as reflected in the collective unconscious. So anyway, so be aware when you enter into this book. There are some great insights, and maybe to give Peterson his due, Andrew, we can just finish by just point out some things that we liked so far in the reading, because there are some good things in here, but you have to be discerning. You have to know what Peterson's doing. You have to know the background ideological framework that he is laying over the text of Scripture. Okay, so anyway, let me just point out some things that I actually liked in closing here, and then I'll turn it over to you. I think that there were some good insights in the Elijah story. I love the fact that he points out that Baal is the nature god, right? who's responsible for like bringing the rain. And what does Elijah do? He calls for a drought for 3 years on Israel. So it's like this direct confrontation with this idol. Yahweh is going up against this idol and defeating him at every turn. So I thought that was a really cool insight. I love, again, Jordan Peterson's high view of Scripture. He thinks the biblical accounts are subtle, sophisticated. You can tell he loves the text. And I love that about reading Jordan Peterson. I really do. He defends the text. At one point, even in the Foreshadowing chapter, he defends the Old Testament text against the charge of xenophobia. I think he has good philosophical insights into the active role of perceptions, right? You talked about the medieval distinction a little bit ago, but we don't just sense the world, right? We don't just take in, as human beings, we don't just take in the raw data of the world around us. We also perceive the world. We objectify the world. And our objectification of the world, our perception of the world, can be manipulated, right? Can be habituated. And so we can perceive the world in ways that are false because we have developed vices, right? And bad habits of living and thinking. And I think Peterson puts his finger on that. And I think this is a great philosophical insight. I also like how he defines character as the habitual embodiment of aim, right? Character as aim embodied, or the habitual pursuit of aim. I think he's exactly right. That is exactly what your character is. What are you aiming at? What is the good at which your life is directed? That is going to mold your character and develop your habits. So I thought that was great. I do agree with him that our conscience is eternally attempting to reveal truth to us. But again, I would side with Cardinal Newman and say our conscience is a reflection of the divine law, not an identification of the divine itself, but a reflection of the divine law as we understand it. And finally, I would say that I love how Peterson points to the fundamentality of Christianity to Western civilization. He talks about Christianity as the foundation of the West. And there's a great quote here I have to read in the last page of the Foreshadowing. He writes, quote, "The Bible is a library of stories on which the most productive, freest, and most stable and peaceful societies the world has ever known are predicated. The foundation of the West, plain and simple," end quote. So I think he gets that exactly right, the importance of Christianity for Western civilization. What are some things, Andrew, in closing here, that you like about the book so far?
We've already gone long, and I agree with everything you've already said. So I don't want to go too much longer. But there are a few things. One of them with the still small voice point. I fundamentally like where he's going with that. I think we can the contrast between nature and God as being beyond nature. He's right on. And in his debate, I don't know if, or not really debate, but his discussion with the cosmic skeptic, Alex O'Connor, basically, that he had, he goes into, he amazingly, his grasp of symbolism is just profound because it allows him to be able to see some very accurate things about God as creator apart from creation that shows up. But what that also ends up meaning is that I don't think by nature, we shouldn't just think of like a naturalist approach to nature. I think history unfolding is another way that we could put this. That in saying that God is not found in the whirlwind, yes, he's distinguishing God from nature in that traditional sense that we would think of nature. But I think Peterson's point is also that God is not necessarily found in the great historical acts of somebody like an Alexander the Great or Napoleon or somebody like that, these world historical figures. His point is meaning is not only affixed to those people who change the world in these, ways that get recorded in the history books. Meaning is something that can be embodied in each and every single person, which is why it's essential that God must be within each and every single person as this voice of conscience. Yeah. So the point, though, is from an existentialist, and he identifies as an existentialist or as a kind of existentialist in Maps of Meaning. And the thing about that is that there's a sense in which I think that's one of the important points for overcoming the kind of malaise of the current culture. It is the way we have to do this. The question is Christianity here to give us the way to overcome that malaise? And I would argue it's not. But in terms of like his realization there that God is not found even necessarily in, or rather, the Spirit of God is not more manifested somehow in these great historical events. It's a profound thing because, especially when Christians themselves today, think about every time somebody gives a testimony, right? The degree of how wonderful their testimony is relative to the degree of their struggle, whatever it was that they were overcoming. I mean, there's kind of a Kierkegaard line about that in Fear and Trembling. If you want to, for your audience, go back and watch the Fear and Trembling episodes we did. But the thing is, what Peterson's pointing to there, I think, is a very profound point. That it's not simply that you have to take hold of and change the entirety of the course of history in order to achieve meaning. That a meaning is a structuring of the self that can occur through the still small voice. There's a humility naturally to it. And Peterson himself embodies, I think, the proper humble attitude in coming to the text, because he comes to it, like you're pointing out, with absolute reverence and a love and a respect for it, and with the openness to the text changing him, which I think is the fundamental thing that we should take away from it. He's absolutely right about that. We disagree not so much with his goal of having of opening us up to the ability for the text to change us. We just disagree with where specifically he thinks that goal is ordering us, right? We think that it's actually, we disagree soteriologically. We disagree in terms of the salvation that's offered. That's the difference.
Yeah. And I would say I fundamentally so far disagree with his characterization of the divine.
That too. Yeah. I mean, I think that's worked into the nature of salvation here. I mean, from Calvin's point, right? All of our wisdom is consistent of the knowledge of God and of ourselves, right? And so there is that sense in which we understand God relative to this salvific model. And so if you mess up the salvific model, you mess up our understanding of God too. And so again, he's messed up I think the transcendent nature of God by making it this transcendental, as you're pointing out, something that ultimately must terminate in pantheism. If God is transcendental, we're pantheists. That's the historical model.
Absolutely.
So he does mess up that, but I mean, the point is that doesn't prevent him from having, as you pointed out, these tremendous insights throughout the text. And as I kind of want to point out again, he doesn't cite theologians almost at all, and he still manages to come away with some just profound insights, many of which that overlap with contemporary evangelicalism, with contemporary Christian theology, which is an amazing thing for a person to do when they don't even consult us. Yeah.
I mean, there's no question that he's brilliant. So, and there is value in reading the book and listening to him for sure. You just have to have discernment.